This is Dateline News and Conversation. We've got a great show tonight. The topic is the topic of a book that was written and published just a couple of years ago. It's called The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. Now, all of you that are watching and listening know what happened on January 3rd when Donald Trump sent the Special Forces Delta Force with a naval armada off the coast of Venezuela to kidnap President Maduro and his wife. My good friend Dan Kovalik is an attorney. He taught law at a university in Philadelphia. He was fired from his job recently because of his political views. We're going to talk about this book, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, for a couple of reasons. Dan predicted what was going to happen on January 3rd. The other reason is because the topic is so relevant to what we're seeing today. Specifically, Donald Trump's use of sanctions on almost every country in the world, but the sanctions that he used and has placed on Venezuela, and now, just today, it's reported that he has added additional sanctions on Iran. I'm happy to bring back my good friend, Dan Kovalik. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Regis, so good to be here. Glad to be here with you.
You know, I read your book. I couldn't go through it fast enough. I believe, and I want people to know, and I want people to buy this book, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, because within a couple hundred pages, Dan, you have documented the American strategy tool that it uses against all countries that it wants to overthrow. We're seeing it all over the world today, like we've never seen it before. But in all the chapters in your book, you detail country after country after country in Central and South America what the United States has done to overthrow governments, from Chile and Argentina, the attempts on Nicaragua, El Salvador, Panama. I mean, the list is endless. But Dan, this is what I didn't know about you. You've been going to Central and South America for how many years now?
Since I was 19, so almost 40 years.
What motivated you when you were 19 years old to go to, where did you go to in Central or South America, and for what reason?
I went to Nicaragua during the Contra War, and I was in a war zone, actually. I went with the Nicaragua Network, which now is in a different form, the Alliance for Global Justice. It's part of that. Ostensibly, I was there to do reforestation work, to plant trees, but really, which we did, but the main reason people were going to countries like that at that time, particularly Nicaragua, was one, to show solidarity with the Nicaraguan people as the U.S. was waging war against it, but also to learn about it, to learn about what was happening, and to go home and tell people. I mean, that's what you were told was the best thing you could do.
So, 19 years old, were you in college?
Yeah, I actually took a month off of school to do it. I just, over the summer, I was reading The Nation magazine, and there was a little advertisement in it for this delegation. So all the money I earned that summer I used to go on that trip. Now, I mean, a little background. It's not like I just was interested. I just got magically interested in it. An event, a historic event that happened when I was 12 years old, really brought me to be very interested in Central America. I was raised Catholic, Roman Catholic. And when I was 12, I remember vividly learning of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador. And he's now a saint, by the way. He was declared a saint by the Roman Catholic Church several years ago. In any case, when I learned not only was he killed, but that most likely he was killed by US backed forces, this very much caused a lot of existential angst on my part because I was raised in a very conservative household, very patriotic, believed the US that we were the good guys fighting the communists. And I wondered why we would kill an archbishop. And frankly, that it planted a seed. It's not like it made me instantly radical, but it kind of was in the back of my mind. And actually, I recently found that in eighth grade, I did a paper on El Salvador. And when you're young like that, it's not like you use a lot of sources. I happened to the source I really used to do the paper was a book that was put out by CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, which is a pretty left wing group. And I didn't know what CISPAS was, and I just got it at the library. But that also impacted me because it talked about the atrocities in El Salvador and that the U.S. was backing them, and that it went back all the way to I think 1932, which with a major massacre that the U.S. was behind in El Salvador. Um, so these things were percolating in my brain when I was very young. And then when I was a little older and I became more politically active again around age 19 or so, um, I just said, look, I have to see for myself what's happening. I could not rely on secondhand information because I was getting so much different information. The mainstream press was telling you that it's the Sandinistas were these brutal communists, and so that's it. That's it. I had to see for myself. And I did. I was there for a month in Ocotal, which is on the border of Honduras. That's where the war was really happening. And it changed my life. I mean, that did radicalize me. I mean, that was it for me. I came home and I joined the Communist Party, and because also I was equally disturbed by what my country was doing to these very poor people, but I was equally impressed with who was helping these very poor people: the Soviet Union, East Germany. And I changed sides, and I never changed back. So there you go.
All right. So you're 19 years old. You've now really become radicalized. Um, we could talk about that on a separate occasion because
Yeah.
that's how my eyes were opened. I became radicalized only some 20 years ago when I went to Jeju Island in South Korea. And for the first time in my life, I realized what the United States was really all about. So, what I want to ask you now is you're 19 years old. Somehow or other, you managed to squeeze in an undergraduate college degree and then a law degree. So, tell me how you did that. How did you fit it in? Were you making trips during those college years and those
Well,
postgraduate years?
yeah, I did. So the next summer at age 20, I drove to Nicaragua from the U.S. with the Veterans Peace Convoy. So these veterans from Veterans for Peace led a humanitarian aid convoy through Mexico, through Guatemala, Honduras, all the way to Managua. which there's a longer story. It took 2 months to even leave the country. The U.S. wouldn't let us leave our own country. They said we were bringing contraband. They said the trucks we were bringing were contraband because the plan was to leave the trucks, which we did do ultimately. But anyway, that was even a more incredible experience. And I made lifelong friends with some of these veterans. A guy named Jerry Condon, who I'm still very close with, Bob Livesey, Raul Valdez. Anyway, these were great guys, Vietnam vets who, their turning point in their lives was being in Vietnam and seeing what the atrocities that were being committed there. And they became lifelong peace activists. And I just thought these were the greatest guys in the world.
So Dan, I was a member of Veterans for Peace for a number of years until I came to Russia, and I know Jerry Condon personally.
Great guy, right? I mean, just a
Yeah,
great,
and
super guy.
was was Brian Wilson on that particular trip?
Well, I'll tell you, he wasn't because it actually, uh, Brian Wilson had his, he was run over by that train like a day before I went to Nicaragua the first time. So
Oh,
he was still recovering. But he wasn't on the convoy, but he did come down to Texas when we were on the border, waiting to try to cross. He did come down and greet us at one point.
all right. Well, continue with that trip.
Yeah. So that was an amazing trip. I mean, I just, again, being with the people I was with, hearing their stories. One guy was a veteran of Bikini Beach, which very few people know about, which he was a nuclear veteran. So what does that mean? Do you know these? You probably know this story. He was on this place called Bikini Beach, and what they didn't know, these soldiers, the U.S. soldiers, is that they were being tested with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, down in the Marshall Islands,
Yeah,
Bikini Atoll.
yeah,
I was there. Go ahead.
yeah. And so he was there. He was there, and he had cancer by that
Oh
time
God.
because of this. And he was on the trip. He was amazing. There's another guy who was in the CIA, and he had been tasked to kill Fidel Castro. And he told some great stories. One of the best stories he told was he said they hired an agent, a woman, to seduce Fidel, and of course she was then supposed to kill him, but instead she fell in love with him and had a child with him. Which was a great. Anyway, so it was such a great trip. And like I said, I mean, I think about it almost every day, and every time I see Jerry, I'm like, Jerry, I always remember that, and I remember you, and uh, just self-sacrificing people who've given their whole life to the peace movement. So again, that was just a very profound thing. Then yeah, then I went to law school, and then law school was pretty much took up. That was pretty engrossing. I went to Columbia Law School. I couldn't do much else besides that. But then after that, I kept going. I was an election observer in El Salvador, the first election they had after the peace agreement was signed. That was 1994. I was in Cuba in '96, saw Fidel Castro there, which was a huge thing for me. That was during the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was very poor, then difficult time, but, wonderful to be there. And I kept going to Nicaragua. I was an election observer there a couple times. And then when I joined the steelworkers, I was a lawyer there. I became very involved in Colombia, South America. Because at that time, and this is between the years like 2000, 2010, Colombia was the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. Between 200 and 300 trade union members and leaders were killed every year in Colombia. No other country was close to that. Crazy. So I convinced my union. I said, look, the U.S. is providing $10 billion in military aid to this country that's killing their unionists. We need to stand up to this. We need to do something. And they supported me in doing that. And I started going to Colombia a lot then, and I met Gustavo Petro then when he was a senator. He's now president. So really, Latin America is my first love, in terms of the movement, in terms of travel, and again, Nicaragua in particular, it just has a real soft spot in my heart, always will. Um, and for a while, as you know, Regis, I took a little detour. I've been involved more in Russia, in the Donbass, in the Middle East too, recently, and now been brought back to Latin America because of this work I'm doing for Gustavo Petro, the president. But also, I've been to Venezuela many times. I've been an elections observer there countless times. And that was the basis of my Venezuela book. A lot of my travels there when I did that, and saw it over a long period of time. I think the first time I went was 2010. I was there in 2007, but just kind of briefly. But 2010, I heard Chavez speak. And then I went pretty often from 2010 up to the pandemic. I was going a couple times a year. So I got to know a lot of people. And I saw the country struggling, after the sanctions were imposed, first by Obama and then by Trump. He really upped the sanctions. And I one time I was an observer, and by the way, I was one of the only observers. No one wanted to go because this is when they had the garimbas there, these violent street protests that the West was backing, of course. And people didn't want to go to observe, and they begged me to go. I said, okay, I'll come. And when I got, I flew in and I left the airport. There was a general there to take my photo like a proof of life. And before we even got on in the car, the whole city blacked out.
Oh.
Literally, it just went black because they were having all these energy shortages and stuff. It was very dramatic and very intense. But so that's it. I mean, that's kind of my journey.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate that. I wanted to establish your credibility uh, as an expert, and you're surely that and more, on Central and South America, the politics, the involvement of the United States in in imposing sanctions, coups, extrajudicial killings, sponsoring death squads. A lot of people know some of that history, but I want to get back to what you did in your book. You captured, I don't know, 40 or 50 years of history of the maybe longer, uh, of the United States violent and vicious uh, attempts to bring any number of governments to toe under their control. And in every chapter in your book, you detail what the United States did, the involvement of the CIA, the attempt to overthrow these governments that they were socialist governments. We're going to talk more about that as we get deeper into this. But
Or just merely social democratic, even. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, yeah.
so I want to get to the book now because I really do hope people will read this book. There's nothing more important and authentic and detailed if people want to know the historical context, which is critical, I think, to understanding what's going on today. So this is, I read your book and I took copious notes. It took me a couple of days, Dan, to figure out how I wanted to approach this interview with you tonight. The first part was just to establish the who and the what and the why of you falling in love with Central and South America and committing your life to this struggle. But I I came up with this after a couple of days of taking all these notes. The most consistent theme and examples in your book from Chile and Argentina, all the way through Peru, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Cuba, etc., revolve around the U.S. strategy of using sanctions against the targeted countries, either oil or resources. Each of your chapters gives examples of that. Tell me a little bit about how you organized that book, and what were you trying to make clear to readers? And I guess most of your readers, probably your target audience, was people in the United States.
Yes, well, absolutely, because I feel that our duty as people, as activists, as people who care about human rights, is to educate Americans about what their government's doing. I remember actually John Stockwell. I think I quote him in there. John Stockwell, who was in the CIA, said something, which really struck me. And I don't even know if I can say the whole thing because it's very sensitive to some of the things he pointed out. But he said, I remember he was the guy who turned against the U.S. and he says, I don't mean to abuse you with verbal violence. He says, but you need to know what your government and its agents are doing around the world. And he describes these atrocities committed by the Contras against families in Nicaragua. And, and the whole point is that if I always trust that if Americans truly knew that this was going on, that they would oppose it. They just don't know what's going on, right? And the one thing that people need to understand, when you talk about covert operations, right, and secret ops, who are they secret from? Really, first and foremost, the American people, right? The people who are being victimized in Latin America, they know what's happening. We're the ones who are kept in the dark. I mean, that's what people need to understand, is that the government's trying to keep us ignorant of these things because they know we would be appalled. Because you're raised to think the U.S. supports democracy, it supports freedom, and it's doing complete opposite. And that's what I wanted to show in the book. That what we claim to be is really the opposite of what we are. And when you realize that, and it's a hard realization at first. But when you do, it has to change, kind of how you live your life. You realize you have an obligation to speak out and to resist,
I do know, and it didn't happen to me until 2012, and I went to Jeju Island in South Korea, and I finally realized what my government had been doing. My undergraduate degree was in United States history and philosophy, and everything I learned about American history had been sanitized. It was
or
just not in the history books. You couldn't find it anywhere. And so I understand exactly what you're saying. The audience is the American people, and they are the ones that have been not just brainwashed, but indoctrinated since birth for generations to believe what you just said, that we're the good guys, spreading freedom and democracy around the world. But when you had an opportunity over some, whatever it was, 40 years, to recognize what your government had been doing just in Central and South America, made you become a communist, made you get involved with the trade union, and made you become an outspoken activist and an author, to try to show American people what their government really was about. I think that's a good place to start, with why you wrote this book. And I want to underscore it again. I want people to read this book, because without this information firsthand, uh, you will never be able to understand and believe the lies that we've all been told. Now, you mentioned this CIA agent that had really turned against the government. That was the next thing I wanted to talk about, Dan. This theme runs through every single chapter in your book, and it's the role of the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the USAID. Um, I got a chance to see that up close and kind of personal uh, while I've been here in the Russian Federation, in Armenia. Um, I've been there a couple of times. I had to renew my visa, and I met a lot of really great people who were involved politically in the situation that's going on. And I saw through their eyes and their testimony the work of the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID. I have many friends who are in Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, who have felt the quote unquote soft power of the United States. But I want you to talk about now your own personal experience that you have documented in your book. The I'm not even going to try to find an adjective to describe it, but what the CIA, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, and the USAID have done in South America can only be described criminal doesn't do it, evil. Take me through that, how you've seen the same pattern over and over and over again that the US government uses to bring about regime change in countries that they don't like or in countries that are not aligned with Americans' basic interests.
Yes, so they have a formula for it that they use in every regime change operation, and it because it tends to work. So the first it's a tried and true method. So the very first regime change of the United States CIA, not of the U.S. because there's been regime changes before the CIA. But if you start with the CIA, which was 1948, their first regime change, successful regime change, was in Iran against Mohammad Mossadegh. And it's important to point out again that first regime change operation looks a lot like all these other ones. You see these patterns. One thing they do is they pay people to protest the government. In this case, they wanted to overthrow a democratically elected government in Iran because they had nationalized the oil fields which Britain had controlled up to that point. And Churchill, who had become prime minister again in Britain, convinced Eisenhower to overthrow the government because Britain wanted its oil back. In the end, they didn't get much of it back as the U.S. took the lion's share. But in any case, so what the CIA did, again, was pay people to protest, but not just to protest the government, to violently protest. And then what they hoped for is that Mossadegh's government would react, overreact, and then they'd say, see, you're repressive, and then justify supporting a coup, which that's exactly what happened. And there were sanctions there, and an oil embargo against Iran, which again softened up the country for this. But the next regime change operation was in Central America, and it's in terms of levels of criminality, one of the worst. So it took place in 1954 in Guatemala, and it was actually spearheaded by the United Fruit Company. Now, at that time, the Dulles brothers, one was head of the CIA, one was head of the State Department, they all had interest in United Fruit. So, United Fruit was upset that this president was elected named Jacobo Arbenz, who wanted to engage in land reform. And what they wanted to do is buy up unused land at market rates and give it to poor people, to peasants. Well, United Fruit didn't want this because a lot of that land was theirs, even though they were going to get paid for it. But by the way, they were unhappy with what they were going to get paid for it because, for taxation purposes, they had intentionally lowballed the value of the land, and that's what they were offered, right? So they were kind of foisted on their own petard, and so they overthrew Arbenz. Again, they supported protests there, and they supported a faction of the military to overthrow Arbenz, which they did. And what followed, and why Guatemala is such a horrible case, is a series of brutal military regimes, which all told killed about 200,000 Guatemalans in brutal ways, mostly Mayan Indians, in what is now regarded as a genocide. Even Bill Clinton admitted it was a genocide and said, he regretted that the U.S. was ultimately behind it. So you had that one, and then again, I'm sure I'll leave some out, but other notable ones, of course, was the overthrow of Allende in Chile in 1973. Again, with the CIA involved, with by the way, the AFL-CIO, the Union Confederation in the U.S., which was during the Cold War very supportive of these regime change operations. And there again, they what they did is again had economic tools that they used to weaken the economy. In fact, Nixon said they would make the economy scream, which they did, which of course undermined the president Salvador Allende. And again, why? Because he wanted social programs, he wanted higher wages for the workers, and this impacted, U.S. corporations that were there, including Anaconda Copper. So they overthrew him. And one thing they did, the Teamsters, what the AFL-CIO did is they paid Teamsters truckers there to strike and to block the highways. And again, to cause chaos, to undermine support for the government. But ultimately, again, at the same time, they supported a wing in the military led by Augusto Pinochet, the infamous, to violently overthrow Allende and kill him and even bomb the presidential palace. They bombed their own presidential palace. And what followed, again, was a brutal dictatorship where at least 3,000 people were killed in very short order, many tortured. Again, a disgraceful episode. Well, those are just a few examples. Of course, and as I mentioned, and a lot of people forget, is that actually, even before the Maduro kidnapping, the U.S. had a successful coup in Venezuela in 2002. It was just short lived. The CIA and the AFL-CIO and NED, they combined efforts to bring about a coup against Chavez, the president Hugo Chavez, in 2002. He was kidnapped again by a wing of the military, who took him to a remote military base, and immediately the right-wing government that the U.S. supported, well, the first thing they did, they went on television and they said, this Constitution, which, by the way, the people had just voted to accept in a referendum, this Constitution, gone. Supreme Court, gone. National Assembly, gone. So the first thing they did is destroy every democratic institution in Venezuela. And the New York Times said this was a flowering of democracy. Just complete Orwellian nonsense, right? But then the people, the poor people from the barrios in the mountains surrounding Caracas, came down into the center city, and they demanded that Chavez be returned. And they because of that pressure, he was returned. And there were some loyal factions in the military who helped bring that about as well, but in response to the public support. So then, outlets like the New York Times had to eat their words. This wasn't democracy. This was just the opposite. And again, what they did, and again, you saw this again in Ukraine in 2014. Very similar thing happened in Kiev, right? So, in one of the precipitating events that led to the coup was that, again, you had these protests against Chavez that were being supported by the U.S. covertly. You also had pro Chavez protests. At one point, there is some of the protesters against the government are shot from a bridge, and they blame the Chavistas for that. But it turns out it was actually people with the opposition shooting at their own people to try to pin it on the government, right? This is exactly what happened in Kiev with the Maidan protests in 2014. You had the same thing. People being shot, protesters being shot. They blamed the government. In fact, it was people who wanted to overthrow the government that were doing it, but the government was blamed. All of the West piled on and said, oh, this government's repressive. They're shooting their own people. And, that right-wing government's put in power that's still in place now. Um, Again, this is a tried and true method. They try to either provoke violence by a government that they mark for regime change, or they just make up. you know, they just lie and say that they're violent when they're
Yeah,
not. And again, you're seeing that in Iran right now. I mean, the point is, if you see this pattern over and over and over again, you're not going to be fooled the next time this happens.
exactly. And I'm so glad you brought this out now in this interview, but your book points that out. And you made the connection with what happened in Kiev in 2014. Absolutely the same playbook. You look at what's happening in Iran right now, and it's been happening in Iran, the same playbook. In fact, I believe Trump just put additional sanctions on Iran to try to squeeze them when Iran is still trying to respond diplomatically. However, right now it looks like this might go in a different direction. Dan, this strategy, I believe, has come home to roost in Minneapolis, Minnesota today. I have two classmates that were with me through freshman year in high school and the seminary, all the way through theology. They didn't go on to be priests, but they have resided in Minneapolis for the last almost 50 years. And these two classmates were talking last night in a meeting that some of us from those days in the seminary have been conducting, and they were telling us exactly what was going on in Minneapolis right now with ICE, these masked thugs, fascist thugs is what it is. And
Absolutely.
and they were telling us that tomorrow the white nationalists are having a rally which everybody believes is going to turn violent. And they believed, these two guys were expressing what people in Minneapolis are thinking and saying, that Donald Trump is behind this.
Yeah.
And the whole intent is to overthrow the United States government. If you can freaking believe that, Dan, they really believe that Trump is going to invoke the Insurrection Act and
Well,
is
he's
going to
threatening to. He's threatening to. Yeah.
exactly and impose martial law so that there won't be any elections in 2023. Now, I just brought that out because from where I'm sitting, I see this same pattern that you're talking about coming home to roost in America right now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's clear. What's become crystal clear is that these ICE stormtroopers, Gestapo, that what they're doing is not about immigration at all. It
Yeah,
is to provoke fear, it is to terrorize the population, and it is to provoke a violent response by the population so that, yes, now the government can justify the militarization of the American cities. And of course, all these cities that ICE is in, they're all Democratic cities. They're all blue cities, right? So this is a way for Trump to go after his political enemies. And yeah, he's using the same tactic that the CIA uses in these other places to effectuate regime change, and it's very scary. I mean, uh, well, in truth, Hitler did similar things, with the beer hall push and all that, and the Reichstag fire. You know, these are tried and true tactics, and I do fear that we're sinking into tyranny, and that this is the tool that's going to do it.
yeah. This is what both of my classmates were expressing last night, and a number of other are guys from different parts of the country. One guy's an attorney. The other guy is a career military guy who was a medical doctor in the military, and they're all expressing the same fear of what now has come home to roost in the United States. I want to get on to another theme, Dan, that I think is so important, uh, is the role of the press in the media. You have made this abundantly clear. Also, in the book that you co-authored with Finian uh, Cunningham and three others about killing democracy. And
Right.
one of the themes in that book was the role of the media. Uh, Dan, how far back does that go? And is this also the work of the CIA? I have been researching a lot of this and researching the true history of the United States of America. And so I know about Operation Mockingbird. The CIA has claimed that it doesn't exist anymore. I am convinced that it is in overdrive right now. They control most of the narrative uh, for all of the mainstream media. Talk to me about the role of the press and the media in brainwashing uh, the American public.
Yes, well, again, this predates the CIA, of course. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Spanish American War and the Remember the Maine and all that. But definitely the CIA has made an art form out of manipulating the people through the press. I mean, in many cases, the CIA will literally write a story and have it published. I mean, but if they don't do it that directly, they have people that they pay to write stories. I mentioned John Stockwell, and John Stockwell was in the CIA at that. He was operating. He was mission chief in Angola when Cuba was there fighting against the terrorists that the U.S. was supporting against the government in Angola. And Stockwell says we would. He said we would write these stories for the New York Times, and they would just publish them, and he gave an example. He said we wrote about we focused on one Cuban brigade, and we claimed that the Cuban brigade it was involved in rapes of the population, that they were ultimately killed, this brigade. And then we wrote another story where they were miraculously resurrected from the dead. And the Times just printed it, you know, and that's an extreme example. But another example we know of very well is the run up to the Iraq War. Judith Miller at the New York Times, everyone knows she was just printing CIA lies about weapons of mass destruction. She was a mouthpiece for the CIA. Ultimately, she lost her position there, but now she's at CNN. It didn't hurt her, destroy her career, but that's what she was doing. And the CIA would later say that what she did for them was critical in paving the way for the invasion of Iraq. And you see this over and over, but there's more subtle ways too. And one example I give in my book, and I've never seen anyone give this analogy, but I kind of like it. So it's what things also the press decides to emphasize over others. And what they do, they emphasize the crimes, real, imagined, made up of our enemies, and they ignore those of us and our friends, right? So the example I give in the book regarding Venezuela is two events that happened in 1989. One is the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre in China. And by the way, there's a lot of misinformation about what really happened there, but I'm not going to get into that. But let's just take the Western narrative of what happened in Tiananmen Square. The Western narrative is that there were peaceful protesters and they were gunned down, and that anywhere between 300 and 3,000 Chinese were killed in Tiananmen Square. And like on every major anniversary of it, every paper does a story about Tiananmen Square. On the 25th anniversary, it's like it's practically a holiday in the U.S. Because why? Because it vilifies the Communist Party of China. Well, but meanwhile, there was a massacre in Venezuela of protesters who were protesting IMF austerity measures, in which, again, and this is true, and it's a coincidence, but it is also estimated between 300 and 3,000 people were killed in that. Okay. In a country of 30 million people, as opposed to China that had over a billion, right? So a much more catastrophic number, right, proportionally. And this is known as the Caracazo. Who knows what the Caracazo is? Have you ever heard of the Caracazo? No one's ever heard of the Caracazo because that is not helpful to the U.S. narrative, because that happened before Chavez actually gave rise to Chavez. The U.S. was supporting the government at that time. It shows the U.S. was supporting a government that was doing things that it was condemning other governments for doing. And it shows that it's not true that Chavez somehow, took a democratic country and made it undemocratic. He inherited it in a fatally undemocratic country and actually democratized it, right? And if you know about the Caracazo and you know about, again, what flowed from that, you would know those things that I've just said. So the point is the press is not going to tell you about them. And I guarantee every kid in America in their civics class and history classes learned about Tiananmen Square. I guarantee you. None of them learned about the Caracazo. And that's another way that the propaganda system works. Again, and now, you can go over and over. One country that no one knows anything about because it's never covered is the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, okay? In the 1990s, Bill Clinton supported an invasion of the Congo that killed 6 million people. Okay, this is well documented. That was a Holocaust. Mostly women and children killed, many of them raped. Who knows that happened? Who knows that Clinton did that for Arkansas mining companies who got the um, interest in the mines after those massacres in Congo? Who knows that those massacres continue to this day? That armed groups backed by the West continue to rape and kill in Congo? No one, because it's not discussed in the press. Who knows that there's child labor in Congo, that kids are working in these mines to mine the precious metals we need for our computers and our phones, and that it was the invasion of Congo which allowed that for that situation to be created. But that's the propaganda system, it ignores our crimes and highlights the crimes of others, again, even if they're made up. And it's very effective. Um, People even who I respect tend to get fooled. One guy now is Cornel West. He's supporting, the overthrow of the government in Iran right now. You'd think he'd know better, but the propaganda, it works. Um,
Um, it works, and it works all the time and everywhere. And what that explains is why the American public has been completely propagandized, but indoctrinated. And it's not just in the media, it's in the textbooks that, history textbooks, it's in all kinds of civic celebrations where America comes across as the good guy. We're never told what's going on. I've been telling people who uh, are telling me about what they think is happening in Russia and Ukraine. I tell them everything you read in the American media, you flip it. It's the exact opposite of what is really happening. And
yeah.
this is exactly what you're talking about. I want to talk about two more things, Dan. Um, One of them is one of the foundations of American foreign policy. Uh, and Bill Blum, before he died, was in contact with me, and I was working on finishing my second film um, about what American foreign policy really was. And basically, he said it's based on three things. It's the spread of American capitalism. It's uh, to the benefit of the military-industrial complex and the banks. And then the second pillar of that belief is that there can be no alternatives to capitalism. And the United States is bent on preventing any society that might serve as a successful example of an alternative to capitalism, socialism, communism, or any system not in line with American interest. And the third pillar of his belief about what is behind American foreign policy is expanding the empire, political, economic, and military hegemony over the entire globe. Is this not what we're looking at today with Donald Trump and what he's done to just totally disregard international law, totally disregard the United Nations Charter, totally disregard the United States Constitution to impose America's version of political dominance over the entire globe? You can see this throughout South America. Many of these countries, as you know, and have reported on, were socialist or social democratic, putting in reforms to benefit their people who have been suffering under American imperialism. The American companies, whether it be American fruit, whether it be Anaconda mining, whatever it was, these presidents like Chavez and Maduro were trying to protect the poor people in their countries, and they were trying to implement land reform. They were trying to provide benefits for their people. You've documented this all very, very well. I want to come to this last point, which actually we started with, is sanctions. Um, the United States today is using sanctions on almost everybody around the world. If you don't bow down to us, I'm going to sanction you. If you continue to do business and trade with Russia, with China, with India, with any of the BRICS countries, I'm going to sanction you. I'm going to punish you. Now, Dan, as a lawyer, as a former, well, you were brought up Catholic, you were brought up with a sense of right and wrong, a sense of morality. Um, Talk to me about sanctions. Sanctions kill. Sanctions,
Sanctions kill. Yes.
they're directed not at governments, they're directed at children, at the poor, the elderly, at women. Sanctions deny countries like Iran today medicine that they desperately need, food, milk, formula for babies. The whole purpose of sanctions is to squeeze the population to turn them against their government. I have I have said that I believe sanctions really are a weapon of mass destruction. Your thoughts on these sanctions, the morality of it, the legality of it. Uh, you bring this out in your book, but let's finish on that topic tonight.
Well,
Sanctions.
when you talk, first of all, if you start with legality, it's totally illegal. These types of unilaterally imposed sanctions, which, by the way, impact other countries, that is, prevents even other countries from trading with the targeted country. Well, only the Security Council of the United Nations can call for those types of sanctions. A country like the U.S. not cannot lawfully just do it. Of course, the U.S. has is one of the few countries in the world that really has the power to do it. As such, because of the dollar being the reserve currency of the world, it allows the U.S. to be able to effectively shut down another country's economy, right? And that's what they're doing. In terms of the morality, what you're saying is absolutely true. There was a very good study actually done of the sanctions regime against North Korea, which has been in place for decades. And what it was concluded, and it was a European group that did the study, that the people affected the most were women and children, and for the reasons you say. In Venezuela, for example, there's a very good study that the Center for Economic Policy Research did in 2018, I think, 2019. They showed in the first year of Trump's increased sanctions against Venezuela, at least 70,000 Venezuelans were killed due to the inability to get chemotherapy medicines, dialysis machines, etc. And that wasn't even that was just looking at the medicines and medical supplies. Didn't even take into account the people who died because the economy was in shambles and people couldn't, didn't have jobs and didn't have money, and it didn't take into account the food that people weren't getting, right? I mean, so the numbers are in the large tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people killed due to that sanctions regime. And the point of those sanctions, they're not aimed at countries because the countries aren't doing well, that they're not succeeding. They're aimed at countries because they're succeeding, because they're using socialist methods to help their people. And as you say, they present the danger of a good example. When Chavez, in the first years of his government, lowered extreme poverty and poverty by huge amounts, provided free schooling to the people, free school lunches to all the children, free health care. Even now, the last count, Venezuela's built over 5 million low income housing units for people. by every measure, even the IMF and World Bank said that Chavez was succeeding, and that's why they sanctioned him. They had to undermine what he was doing because they didn't want other countries to follow him, and they were starting to with what was called the pink tide. Other countries turned to left wing leaders like Bolivia and Ecuador and Chile and Argentina, and this was unacceptable to the U.S. So Venezuela had to be punished. The people of Venezuela had to be punished, and that's how these things work.
Oh, Dan, um, it's kind of overwhelming and depressing to talk about this, but uh, I think we need to put this right out there in the face of the American public. We can't do it often enough. Your book hopefully will do it, will open some eyes. I hope this show might do a little bit to open people's eyes. Um, and I think, the goal, your goal and my goal is not just to inform people, but to get people to do something. Because as
Yes,
you said in the beginning, if people do rise up, like they did with like Chavez. They demanded that he be returned. The people in Venezuela are doing the same thing today, massive rallies demanding that Maduro and his wife be returned. These are examples for me to the American public, what they're going to have to do to reclaim their country, to reclaim what they believe is their democracy. And I think, Dan, with what Trump is doing today with sanctions all over the world, it's an example of what the American people need to realize and do if they are going to take back their country. This was really an amazing interview, Dan. I appreciate it so much. Um, we got to look forward to doing some more of these one-on-one interviews with you to get your views on what is happening and what will continue to happen in Venezuela and in Nicaragua and El Salvador and throughout Central and South America, because this story is now just being written. And
yes.
so I can't thank you enough, my friend. We'll look forward to doing it again.
Regis, I really enjoyed it. And it's just like talking to an old friend. So thank you very much.